And we're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Dr. Debra Durham. Dr. Debra Durham is an ethologist with a PhD in animal behavior and more than 10 years of field and laboratory experience working with primates and primate issues. Before joining PETA as a primate specialist, she worked in laboratories at the University of California, Davis, and at the Washington National Primate Research Center in Seattle. Dr. Durham is a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and the International Primatological Society. And she is co-founder and vice president of the International Association for Animal Trauma and Recovery and a senior researcher at the Carlos Center for Animal Psychology. If we could begin, can you start out and tell us a little bit about PETA?
People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, is an organization that promotes awareness and works on behalf of animals and animal rights. So our slogan is that animals are not ours to eat, wear, experiment on, or use in entertainment. And we work on animal issues in all of those domains.
All right. And you are listed as a primate specialist with PETA. Can you tell us about what that is?
Sure. So my background, as you said, is in animal behavior, and I specialize in non-human primates. So my work for PETA has to do with primate exploitation, and I work exclusively on the issue of animal experimentation. So we're talking about regulatory testing and other forms of experiments that are performed on animals.
All right. And how did you get involved in this issue? Because it sounds like from your bio that you used to be working in labs.
Right. So I'm an alum at the University of Washington, and while I was there, I worked at what was at the time the Washington Regional Primate Research Center. And there I worked in a couple of different capacities there. I worked with infant primates who were not living with their mothers. They were living in laboratory cages. And then I also worked in a program that was intended to serve their psychological welfare needs. And while I was, this was a time when, I was absolutely on fire intellectually for the study of primatology. And when I was in those labs, I felt so troubled by what I was seeing, by the distress that I was seeing with the babies in particular, who were so distraught about being alone and being without their mothers or with any adult. They sort of had this rag doll in their cage that was their sole source of comfort for all but maybe 20 minutes a day. And other animals who were in their cages bouncing and spinning and pacing, and animals who were self-mutilating. And it was so troubling that I decided I had to get away from that. And I went on, when I was doing my doctoral work, to study the natural behavior of wild primates, to really see, what is a primate life like? What is primate behavior like? What is the primate mind like? And I felt like I was able to observe that in the wild. And when I finished my doctoral work, the question was, well, how do you use this knowledge for the benefit of primates? And conservation had always been a passion of mine, protecting these animals in the wild, but it seemed equally important to protect them in captivity. And my early experience in the laboratory drew me back, and I decided that I would use what I knew about primates to work hard for their protection where they are imprisoned in laboratories.
So then what is your response to those people that say we agree with you that it's not nice to harm primates, but we need to work on them to come out, for instance, with these new drugs that they're cranking out right now?
Well, I understand that people are concerned about their health, and they're concerned about being able to stay healthy and keep the people that they care about healthy. But I think it's important to actually look at how animals are being experimented on, and in this case, primates, and how that actually translates into drugs that people can use. And so I think it's useful to think about a couple of statistics in that case, if I may. So there was a study that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a highly respected medical journal. It was published back in October. And the investigators took a look at animal experiments in the top-ranking journals in the country, actually in the whole world, and they found those studies that had been cited by other scientists at least 500 times. So these were the best studies in the best journals, and these were studies from 1980 to 2000. And when they actually broke them down and said, okay, how are these studies translating into medicine? When they looked at, okay, where there's an animal model of disease, where scientists have been able to create the symptoms of a disease in an animal model, and where they are testing an intervention, like a drug candidate, for example, that only accounted for 6.4% of those animal experiments in their study. So it's actually a relatively small proportion of the animal experimentation that takes place. That's my first point. And once we get past that, we have to think about concordance, right? How often does a drug candidate behave the same way in an animal model and the human model? And these scientists looked at this, and they boiled it down to a certain number of studies, and they found that in this case, with the best studies in the best journals, the human and animal results matched about 30% of the time, and they were contradictory about 20% of the time, and about 50% of the time, the animal experiments were never replicated. They never got to the stage where people were attempting to repeat them in human beings. And I think we see this same limit on translation when we're getting into other studies. So, for example, once drugs move into human clinical trials, so that would be after they've proven safe, supposedly, and effective, supposedly, in an animal model, and they move into human clinical trials. There's not very good translation there. And in January of 2006, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Mike Leavitt, talked about this, and he addressed it. And he was actually talking about the importance of bringing human testing in much earlier in the drug development process. And he said currently 9 out of 10 experimental drugs fail in human clinical studies because we cannot accurately predict how they will behave in people based on their performance in animal studies. So that's 9 out of 10. The statistics, if you break it down a little bit more finely, for most drugs, the failure rate hovers around 92%, and for cancer drugs, it's actually closer to 95%. So we're actually not getting the translation that I think people believe occurs and that they expect to occur. And so we have this bottleneck here where we're using hundreds of thousands of animals every year globally and not getting the translation that we want. So only one candidate in 1,000 makes it from the very early discovery stages to human clinical trials. And once they're in clinical trials, 9 out of 10 fail. So we end up with a success rate that's about 10 in 100,000. And then we go on, and we know drugs like Vioxx or TGN-1412, which was a miserable failure in human clinical trials. And we think, well, how come this isn't working? Aren't monkeys a lot like people? Well, monkeys are pretty close to people genetically speaking. But the monkey test did not protect the 6 men that were used in the TGN-1412 trial last year. The drug was given to 28 monkeys for almost 30 days at doses that were 15 to 100 times higher than what the human subjects got. And yet, within an hour after being given that drug, these men were on their way to multiple organ failure. The safety of a drug cannot be proven in an animal model. And the efficacy of a drug cannot be proven in an animal model. We've cured cancer several times in mice, and we still don't have a solution for human beings. So when people are concerned about the use of animal experimentation in drug development, I just ask them to take a closer look at the statistics, because whenever there's a systematic review with rigorous statistics looking at the success in translation, it's actually quite poor. And so we might wonder if we don't end up with new drugs in spite of animal testing rather than because of it.
And are there other then options available instead of animal testing?
Mm-hmm. So right now, the regulatory environment in the United States requires animal testing. But replacing animal tests with some other methods is something that's on the horizon and something we definitely need to be investing in vitro technologies, for example, which would be tests in cells and human cells at that. I mean, let's get right down to it. There's also human microdosing, which can be used in the early stages of drug development, where tiny, tiny, tiny doses of a drug are delivered to human beings to help medicinal chemists understand what's happening. And I think we just need to invest in what's happening. People are really talking about us being on the brink of a time when medicines will be designed to the genetic profile of the individual. So, we're talking about genomics, for example, or proteomics, where we're actually going to be able to take the genetic fingerprint of a person who has disease XYZ and be able to diagnose them rapidly and quite possibly come up with the perfect, customized treatment. And we're not there yet, but we're getting close, and we should be investing in technologies that are going to get us there sooner and with better results.
So getting back to the work you do on keeping an eye on animal experimentation, how do you choose the individual cases that you work on?
Well, cases that come to my attention end up there for several different reasons. With PETA, one of the ways cases come to our attention is through whistleblowers. People who come forward, people on the inside who see something that they're deeply troubled by, and they elect to bring it to our attention either anonymously or including disclosing their identity. So people who were like me, people who were the student in the laboratory where animals aren't getting proper care or their pain isn't being alleviated for them, might come forward. I've received mail in plain white envelopes with no return address that just say, I've seen this terrible thing and it troubles me. Please help. And so PETA as an organization and me as an individual representing PETA, whistleblowers are an absolutely vital part of our campaign because we can't be everywhere all the time, and we depend on those other eyes and ears. And that is really important because they can provide information that's often not available when, you're outside. Because laboratories, that information isn't publicly accessible. It's locked doors. There's no windows. There's no sign on the door that says, I'm performing an experiment on 50 monkeys by injecting them with toxic substances. So when we find out about it, sometimes we find out about it when we learn about inspections done by outside agencies and organizations. For example, the United States Department of Agriculture is charged with monitoring for the Animal Welfare Act, the single piece of federal legislation that protects some animals in laboratories, including primates. Mice and rats, unfortunately, aren't protected under the Animal Welfare Act. But primates are listed. So when we learn about a really dreadful USDA inspection, for example, that organization ends up on our radar, and we try to find out more about what's going on there. What kinds of experiments? How many animals are being used? Is there a history of violations in the past that might send up a red flag that this is a chronic or repeat problem? And we start digging that way.
All right. So can you give us an overview of what's currently happening here in Washington State in terms of primate experiments?
Sure. So, there's a couple of cases, I guess I'd talk about. An example of what I was just talking about, sort of a terrible USDA inspection, throwing up a red flag on a local organization, actually has to do with a private contract testing organization up in Everett, Washington, SNBL, which I believe stands for Shen Nippon Biomedical Laboratories. And I recently saw their USDA inspection from 2005, which is the most recent inspection that's available to the public at this time. And it was brought to my attention by another animal protection organization. And they asked, hey, can you check this out? Tell me what you think about the citations here for primates. And I was shocked at the nature of the violations that had taken place, because there are a lot of primates at SNBL. SNBL is actually the single largest holder of primates in Washington State. They have around 3,000, at least the most currently available government reports suggest it's 3,000. And despite the fact they had 3,000 monkeys there, not to mention other animals, at the time of the inspection, they didn't have a full-time veterinarian or a written veterinary medical plan. And I can't imagine animal welfare ever being positive without access to veterinary care. That's kind of the most minimal, basic requirement. And there were other failures there, and these are failures described by the USDA. They're not PETA's description. Monkeys were kept in cages that didn't meet that were too small to meet federal regulations, for example. And the USDA inspector really was harsh with the organization's internal oversight. So each institution and organization has an institutional animal care and use committee. And this is a committee that's mandated by the Animal Welfare Act and some other federal regulations by the Public Health Service and National Institutes of Health, for example. This committee is very important for ensuring that proposed projects meet federal standards for animal welfare, and then also compliance oversight. So once experiments are actually underway, the committee has responsibility for ensuring that it it complies to federal standards and practice. And the USDA inspector had really harsh criticisms for the Animal Care and Use Committee there, and actually said in her report that some actions of the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee were, quote, not based on sound scientific or medical justification. And I think the public trusts that these systems in place are going to function and provide animals at least some basic minimal protections. But this report, they found animals with untreated injuries. They found animals who were emaciated but who were not given medical care, so they didn't have adequate food and water. And the animals, it was a specific kind of monkey in one case, a marmoset monkey, which is from South America rather, and they normally live in pairs with their offspring. And they're very territorial, and they will fight with other pairs, for example. But instead of housing them in pairs, they were housing them in same-sex groups. And so in a pair-based animal, of course, females fought each other vigorously and males fought each other vigorously. And there were several very serious injuries and some that turned out to be fatal. So when I read this report, I was absolutely stunned, and I thought, wow, red flag for SNBL. This is a place that's growing. They're constructing new facilities there. They're adding monkeys, and indeed they are. They are growing. There was a tenfold increase in imports from Cambodia. Monkey imports from Cambodia last year, a tenfold increase. And it was due almost exclusively to purchase agreements with SNBL. This is a place that's booming, and they're doing big business bringing in monkeys from overseas. And so that's one of the big things here locally that I'm keeping my eyes open for.
And that being a private company, does that hinder your ability to be able to see what's going on there?
Completely. With private companies, Washington open public records laws do not apply, and federal laws like the Freedom of Information Act that can be used to obtain information are also not binding. So other than requesting reports directly from government agencies that may have oversight over SNBL, like the USDA report I mentioned, that can be requested directly from the USDA because it is bound by the Freedom of Information Act. Makes it really hard to get information. And so we rely heavily on what comes out through the other agencies, and we just have to cross our fingers and hope that a whistleblower will come forward.
Okay, talk about the other significant player in this. I saw locally that the University of Washington just had a lot of press on inspections from an organization called ALAC.
So ALAC is a little bit different than the USDA in that they're actually a private accrediting organization, and participation in their programs is voluntary. But they do go through and look at the performance of animal laboratories using their own internal standards. And the accrediting agency actually put the University of Washington on probation for the status of their animal laboratories. And this was a particularly important case for me, this University of Washington example, because as I mentioned, I'm an alum there. I lectured there back in 2005. So I feel a connection to the university. But the fact that things are so bad that they're on probation is really stunning. And I made several public records requests regarding the university's status with ALAC and believe that that played a role in the university's decision to announce the fact that they were on probation because their press conference coincided with the date which the records were ultimately released to me. And so this is actually something, the university was inspected in June of 2006, and at the time of their exit interview, they were told that the problems were extensive, and they were expecting some bad news from ALAC, which is, of course, terrible news for animals. But they got their official notice in November of 2006. They didn't actually come forward to tell the public that they'd been put on probation or to share information about the status and performance of their animal laboratories until February 12th or 13th of 2007. And when they did that, when they did finally come forward, I think it's really significant that they framed the discussion as one about money. We need $20 million right now in order to correct these problems. And that was the figure that came out and that was reported in the press. And I sort of scratched my head and thought, well, if the $20 million was so urgent, why wasn't it requested in June? Why wasn't it requested in November? Why is it that the discussion now is about accounting and not accountability? And it was very, very shrewd public relations move. I will give them credit for that. But in truth, I think that it just diverted attention from the real issue here, which was performance. Buildings don't get old overnight, and it's certainly not an unexpected phenomenon. The architects knew that the buildings would get old before they even started drawing them. And the infrastructure is a problem. But when the infrastructure is inadequate and you buy animals and put them in dilapidated facilities year after year and day after day, then it really is as much about the decision to use the substandard facilities and to subject animals to those risks as it is about the fact that the buildings need to be repaired. And so I really want this discussion to be about accountability, and I want it to be about performance, and I want us to, let's think about the infrastructure, sure, but let's also think about the integrity here. If the university crammed 20 students into a dorm room built for 2, the public wouldn't accept it. And ALAC found that several of the university's animal facilities were seriously overcrowded. It's the same kind of decision. It's a poor decision, and they need to be held accountable for those decisions. We wouldn't accept it if students were put in a windowless classroom where the ventilation system didn't work and then no instructor showed up. So we shouldn't accept it when they put animals in facilities with no ventilation system and no one showing up to care for them.
Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. How many animals, how many primates are we looking at the University of Washington?
At their facility, it's between 800 and 1,100. They keep some of their animals at a Tulane facility, and they also have 2 offshore facilities, one in Indonesia and one in Nepal. And because those are outside of U.S. jurisdiction, they're not counted on governmental reports, and we don't have good numbers for the number of monkeys there.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming in this morning.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
We have just been talking with Dr. Debra Durham. She is a primatologist, a primate specialist with PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals.